thinks it's all good. So looking at chapters 9 and 10, we're going to see the day is finally going to come, the decree that Haman put out there, and then that Mordecai was undoing so they could defend themselves. Esther's going to then bring about a second day for this decree. So there's more requesting from Esther for the king. And then chapter 9, verse 20 through 10, verse 3 is really kind of the author recapping the story and saying, here's why we have Purim or Purim. This is how the holiday came to be. This is why we do it today. And just recaps the whole story and how the holiday came to fruition. So we left off in chapter 8. That's everything that was the summary, just a summary of chapter 8. A lot of reversals. The king thinks the problem is solved. Esther's still saying we need to be able to defend ourselves. Mordecai writes in or redoes or undoes a undoable decree. And the Jews, right, all the reversals. They go from mourning to being rejoicing, from fasting to feasting. And then we left off with the question of, are people converting to Judaism? Or are they just picking the side of the king? There's fear of the Jews, which sounds very similar to language to when nations have fear of Yahweh. It doesn't say that. Remember, no God in Esther, but maybe it's hinting at that. So that's where we left off. Last week and this week, we're kind of a lot in the parts of Esther that are forgotten, because after Haman's over, it's kind of the end of the VBS story, the kid's story, it's kind of the end of it. Now, to be fair, Esther, especially 8, 9, and 10, or more 9 and 10, the author does kind of, wrap it up, to be fair to us. The author does begin to bring this to a conclusion. So chapter 9, verses 1 through 10, I'll go ahead and read it. So here what was doomsday. In the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on his 13th day, the edict of the king and his law were to be executed. It was on this day that the enemies of the Jews had supposed that they would gain power over them, but contrary to expectations, the Jews gained power over their enemies. The Jews assembled themselves in the cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to strike out against those who were seeking their harm. No one was able to stand before them, for dread of them fell on all the peoples. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who performed the king's businesses were assisting the Jews. For the dread of Mordecai, so it goes from the Jews to Mordecai, had fallen on them. Mordecai was of high rank in the king's palace, and his word about him was spreading throughout all the provinces. His influence continued to become greater and greater. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, bringing death and destruction, and did as they pleased with their enemies. In Susa, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. In addition, they also killed, look at all these names, Parshandatha, Dalphon, Asphatha, Paratha, Adalia, Eredatha, Parmasta, Eresai, Eredai, and Vyasatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not confiscate their property. So even localized, killing 500 people in just one city is a big hubbub. Like, it's a battle, it's empire-wide. But if you notice there in verse 1, I'm calling it kind of like a breaking of the fourth wall. Very explicitly, maybe your translations say the reverse occurred. Kind of said about Haman was being hung on the very gallows that were built for Mordecai in chapter 7, verse 10. But if you kind of summed up the dramatic irony of Esther with a verse where it just comes out and just tells you what to think, would be Esther 9:1, which is leading all the way up to this. What you suppose or thought happened is turned on its head. The reverse occurred. Expectations are subdued and reversed. Now, it is interesting that Mordecai, he gets a lot of attention here in chapter 9. But at the very end, it is going to come back to Esther. But Mordecai, people have fear of Mordecai. Actually, what verse was that? Verse 4, the end of verse 4. He continued to become greater and greater. It's like the rising of Mordecai, it's not even done. He's still excelling. So with Mordecai in charge, the Jews, of course, can defend themselves. So what do we think is the deal, like verses 7 through 10, really, with all the names, but those are the 10 sons of Haman. Why is it not enough for, obviously, it's not unjust. The sons of Haman were clearly on Haman's side. They were there to persecute and destroy the Jews as well. They're guilty, for sure. But remember Haman's family line. You guys remember Haman's family line? Some of us remember. Okay, Mitchell's nodding his head. Mitchell, what was Haman's family line? Sorry to pick on you. Okay, from Agag, who was the Amalekite, right? So remember the Amalekites, if you go all the way back to Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, if you go all the way back to King Saul, who we're going to talk about, he's related to Mordecai, comes from the same tribe of Saul, Benjamin. There's been this theme of the Amalekites who were cruel to Israel, and that's why God has been continually saying for generations to wipe them out. And it's almost as if, in my mind, in other commentaries' minds and scholarships' minds, as if finally this job is kind of being fleshed out, and we're getting toward really the end of the Old Testament era, at least chronologically. You're toward very close to the end of the Old Testament. It's like, well, finally, Agag and the Amalekites are finally going to get wiped out. This was a commandment in Exodus 17. It's the commandment that King Saul refuses to obey in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And that's probably why, not probably, I would say it's why you have the language. It was used there in verse 10. In the New English translation, they did not confiscate their property. Your Bibles probably say it a little bit differently, but they don't plunder their goods. Your Bibles probably say something like that. Okay? When you think about divine warfare, like conquering the land of Canaan and the story with the Amalekites, why do we suppose that they don't plunder their goods? Any thoughts about that? The Jews can defend themselves, but in their conquering of them, they don't take their stuff. They don't confiscate their property. It's kind of what you do when you defeat your enemy. You take all the goodies. Jennifer, you have a thought?
Well, yeah, they're not greedy. They would do it to get their plunder and get it for recompense.
Okay, that's one.
That recompense isn't- But I also don't understand, they didn't stop. I mean, they didn't stop at killing, at the killing of Haman's sons, which I thought would have been good, but boy, they were real killers. They just
Well, it
kept
is empire-wide, because remember, the edict originally was empire-wide, telling anyone in the empire to wipe out and plunder the Jews. So remember, we left off with you can't undo what the king has said. Mordecai has come as close as you can by rewriting the whole decree. It's more recent. But there's still a choice to be had, because some people still follow Haman's decree who hate the Jews. And so here's the Jews fighting back. But certainly the Jews aren't doing it for just mere personal greed and gain. That's a very good point. What else? Why else do we think they're not plundering the property? I think there's more. I think that's definitely a correct lens. I think there's more. Mitchell?
If they kill all these people but don't take their stuff, that means that everybody else can take their stuff. So it makes them kind of ingratiated in the eyes of the people around them, because they did the dirty work. Now everybody else can reap the benefits of the Jews doing the heavy lifting and killing these people.
Okay. I think that could, okay, I see what you're saying. So politically, it gets the Jews kind of a positive favor of taking out the bad guys, and everyone else gets to benefit. Yes. Yeah, that could help them long term for sure. I like that. That's a good angle for sure. Yes, Brian.
Yeah, there's also the problem with they probably had a lot of idol paraphernalia.
Yes.
And the Jews classically did not have a very good track record with that.
Yeah, there's always a warning. I think it's in Deuteronomy. Pretty real sure it's in Deuteronomy, where it talks about mentioning in divine warfare. It's very specific to not just take their stuff. Don't take their idols, because of what that could lead to. There could be some of that in the background as well. I think that's fair. Any other thoughts? I think all these are very good thoughts. So this is, I'm calling it divine warfare in the sense of this is what you see in the theocracy of the Old Covenant with the nation of Israel, right? The reason why the Canaanites are driven out is not for racial superiority or anything, but it's because they're a wicked, violent people. And God tells the Israelites, if you do the same things, God is not, right? God's not going to play favorites. God tells the Israelites, if you do the same things as the Canaanites, the land will spit you out. And that's exactly why Esther and Mordecai are even in the Persian Empire, because the people of Israel did the same thing before them. But I'm using this terminology of divine warfare, where they don't confiscate the property. Like the story of Jericho. If you remember the story of Jericho, it's the first city that gets attacked by Israel when they're led by Joshua into the Promised Land. And God says not to take any of the goods for yourself. Right? One guy does. Right? One guy does take the goodies for himself, and it leads to greed and destruction. But the reason why they're not supposed to do it is as if it's a sacrifice to God that they're not taking the plunderings of Jericho. You kind of see that themed out. It's kind of like tithing in the law of Moses. It's kind of like giving of the first fruits that you see in the law of Moses, the first fruits offered to God. It's the same thing with this divine warfare. Now, Esther doesn't say all that. Remember, Esther's devoid of the law of Moses. Doesn't say Lord God, Yahweh, nothing, right? That's what makes Esther so weird. But if you're putting it in a religious context of the Jewish canon, which it is in the Jewish canon, then you'd probably be thinking, oh, this is hinting at those things. It's hinting at the law, it's hinting at God, of course. And of course, like I said at the beginning of this topic, it's aimed at Amalek. That's the family of Haman. They've been a problem since the wandering of wilderness, for crying out loud. They were a problem since the first king of Israel was in there. It's been a long-standing issue. So any other comments or questions or thoughts about this section here? Okay, it seems like everyone's tracking. So Esther gets another request. So I guess if you were counting, I didn't think about counting it. Esther requests the banquet. Esther requests to have a second banquet. And then in the second banquet, the request is to save me, get rid of Haman. And then in chapter 8, the request was, can we rewrite what Haman had said so my people don't die? So I guess it's kind of number 5. But the same language is used. If you pick up in verse 11, on that same day, okay, still the day of battle, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, were brought to the king's attention. Okay, and the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? He's like, it must have gone well for you. And then it's interesting. He says, what's your request? It shall be given to you. What other petition do you have? It shall be done. Okay, we've heard this before. The king, again, is offering to be very generous once again. We've heard him use the same language of pretty much saying, what do you want? I'm going to do it. So Esther still has favor. And so Esther replied, verse 13, if the king is so inclined, let the Jews who are in Susa be permitted to act tomorrow, also according to today's law, and let them hang the 10 sons of Haman on the gallows. So the king issued orders for this to be done. A law was passed in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. Verse 15, the Jews who were in Susa then assembled on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa. But, again, it's repeated, they did not confiscate their property. Okay, I'll pause there. Why Esther asked, now to be fair, it's just in Susa. So the next day is not empire-wide. This one all of a sudden is located just in the capital in Susa. Esther requests a second day of what I'm calling divine warfare on top of Haman's sons being hung. They're dead, but she wants them made an example of, I suppose. Why? Any ideas? I don't have a specific one at the top of my brain. Why does Esther say, can we get day 2 here in Susa? Any theories with that? There's probably a few options. Why does Esther request? Because we've heard the king say, whatever you want. Says it again, and Esther says, yeah, I'll take you up on that. We want a second day here in Susa of battle. Any ideas? Stumped the crowd? Is this a stumper? You just want me to dish you all the answers? I can't. No ideas? None?
Well,
Just for kicks? Is Esther just bloodthirsty? Like, what do we think? What's going on?
No, because there were still people, like you said, that didn't know, that were still into killing all the Jews, so.
Okay, I think it's as simple as that, which is, it's kind of like bonus relief for the Jewish people. I mean, the fact that they just killed 500 people just in Susa, and that's kind of like where the whole problem started with Haman and his family. I don't think it's, as far as I can tell, I don't think it's like a bloodthirsty thing of let me get some while I can. I think it's like bonus extra relief for the Jewish people. There's still people who'd like to kill them, frankly. Any other thoughts about that? I think it's as simple as that. Yes?
That principle of you got to wipe everybody out.
And very good. And if you go back to where Israel struggled with those tied in with the Amalekites, I don't know if all these people are exactly the Amalekites, but they're led by Amalekites with Haman's family. It would definitely thematically go to that concept, which is this: we've got to get rid of this evil. And overall, the nation of Israel hadn't really done that, and it keeps biting them right in the keister. Keeps coming right back for them over and over again.
We also have the principles going leading up the Old Testament too.
Yeah. Very good point.
All out. When they didn't do it, they come back, there's no problem.
Any other thoughts? It's an astute angle for sure. If you go down to verse 16, so the rest of the Jews who were throughout the provinces of the king assembled in order to stand up for themselves and to have the rest of their enemies. And so this is where some discussion and debate goes, because it sounded like Esther was saying Susa. Now it seems much more wide scale. Maybe it's just a summary. They killed 75,000 of their adversaries, but they did not confiscate their property. All this happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar. Then they rested on the 14th day and made it a day for banqueting and happiness. And I'll keep reading. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and 14th days. Okay, so they do it twice. So that was a recap. And rested on the 15th, making it a day for banqueting and happiness. This is why the Jews who are in the rural country, those who live in rural villages, set aside the 14th day of the month of Adar for happiness, banqueting, a holiday, and sending gifts to one another. So it begins the explanation of the specific days and the differences of those days when it comes to the holiday of Purim. Now, Esther's request, the second day, is interesting, but I think it's just about ultimately extra relief. Now look at verses 20 through 23, or 20, we'll read 20 through 23, but it goes through verse 32. This huge section of chapter 9 really focuses on the details, again, explaining the origins of this holiday. Mordecai wrote these matters down and sent letters to all the Jews who were throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, to have them observe the 14th and 15th dates of the month of Adar each year, time when the Jews gave themselves rest from their enemies, the month when their trouble was turned to happiness and their mourning to a holiday. Okay, see all the explicit reversals? These were to be days of banqueting, happiness, sending gifts to one another, and providing for the poor. So the Jews committed themselves to continuing what they had begun to do and to what Mordecai had written to them. So again, there may be some hinting, like there, what was that, verse 22, maybe hinting at some concepts in the law of Moses, maybe even the most basic one that Jesus quotes, Leviticus 19:18, to love your neighbors yourself. But there is a sense of communal identity for the Jewish people in here. But it's going all to the holiday's origins being explained. And it was interesting, it's Mordecai who records these events, at least initially here. But this language of the role reversals I was pointing out as I was reading it, sounds very similar to Jeremiah 31:13, where God promises to reverse and redeem the nation of Israel. Now, if you know your Bible, Jeremiah 31 ultimately gets into what we participate in every Sunday about the new covenant. Jeremiah 31 promises a new covenant. Jesus takes that language at the Lord's Supper on Passover when he institutes the supper and says, this is the new covenant in my blood. So the big picture scope of God's people is reversal and redemption. But you see it here in a microcosmic sense when Mordecai records the events. It's something that God just likes to do. God likes to reverse the roles and in doing so redeem his people. Pretty continuous theme. And actually, while I'm on that, I don't have it on the screen, but it's a good question to ask with this. When you think of Esther in line to the whole totality of Scripture, all 66 books, how does Esther play a role in the sense of God's plan of salvation? Because God's big picture plan of salvation, what's at stake in the book of Esther when it comes to God's plan of salvation, when you think about it, when it comes to sending his Messiah and all that? It's very hard to put Esther in these questions because, like we said, it doesn't mention the law, it doesn't even mention God. But the Jews have it in the canon, and we have it in the scriptural canon for many reasons. This may be one of them. Yes, Ricky?
We can't avoid the history of the Jews. They can't, in that time frame, everything that it implies God, his power, his plan, and there's nothing they can do about it. And when it's time for him to bring about the ultimate plan, it will happen.
So you're talking about God's providence and sovereignty, which is kind of like the thing to take away from Esther. But of course, when you think about I guess I'll ask it one more time. When you think about the whole story of even to Jesus Christ, how does this story affect the story of Jesus Christ in a very practical sense? What was Haman's decree? Wipe out the Jews. Well, I mean, now this is square one type of stuff back to Genesis 12 and all that with Abraham. Through you, Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, right? And I would have to be super, super, super thorough and wide scale. But if Haman got his wishes, right, and so to say, God's covenant people who are supposed to bless all the nations are gone, right? So even in the scope of that, if the Jews aren't saved, you don't have those promises being kept to Abraham or to David for that matter. And there is no lineage for the Christ to come. I know that's stepping outside of the book of Esther, but I do want it seen in that scope within the canon of the whole story of the Bible. And speaking of like a gospel, verses 29 through 31 is interesting. If we skip down, look at this language. So it basically goes through everything as to how and why we celebrate Purim. Okay, go down to verse 29. So Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew wrote, so it's Esther and Mordecai, they wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the empire of Ahasuerus, words of true peace. That's how the New English translation puts it. To establish these days of Purim in their proper times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established, and just as they had established both for themselves and their descendants matters pertaining to fasting and lamentation. Esther's command established these matters of Purim, and the matter was officially recorded. That's verse 32. But 29 through 31 specifically, remember, we've had these decrees sent out. In chapter 1, the decree was sent out, and 2, to go find a new wife for the king, because Vashti was rebellious. And then the decrees were sent out by Haman to, hey, mark your calendars, it's Kill the Jews Day. On this day, you can go and get them. And then that was reversed to send out all the couriers from Mordecai saying, nope, the Jews can defend themselves. And now, going or empire-wide, there's this decree there of peace and truth. That's how a lot of translation put it. How did this one? Words of true peace. Yeah. So peace and truth, right? It doesn't say the word, but I mean, this is kind of like a proto or a shadow of the gospel. It is a gospel in the sense of, remember, gospel just means good news, right? So you're seeing here's good news. Peace and truth, those are obviously themes you'll see with the very character of God. Remember? Path of grace and truth comes from Yahweh's character in Exodus 34. That again, I think it's hinting in the background about that. Just fascinating. Okay, read chapter 10 with me. King Ahasuerus then imposed, okay, this is strange, imposed forced labor on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. Feels really random. Now all the actions carried out under his authority and his great achievements, along with an exact statement concerning the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king promoted, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus. He was the highest ranking Jew, and he was admired by his numerous relatives. He worked enthusiastically for the good of his people and was an advocate for the welfare of all his descendants. Any ideas? Okay, if you're stumped, because I'm stumped, and a lot of people are like, what's going on here? What's with King Ahasuerus imposing forced labor? Some translations might say imposing tax, depending on how they translate it. What's with the extra labor and tax? And the land, and the coastlands of the sea, I think all it's trying to say is this was extensive. Susa is in the middle of the land. It's nowhere near the ocean, really. This is saying it's going, as we might say in the United States, coast to coast. Say it's empire-wide. What's the deal with Ahasuerus' forced tax or forced labor being thrown in here? Because overall, the whole thing is like, things are great, things are really good, and then it just kind of mentions, oh yeah, and Ahasuerus had this extra tax on the land for everyone, and then it goes right back into, hey, Mordecai, all his stuff is recorded, the end, everyone lived happily ever after, so to say. Any concepts of what's with the extra tax or forced labor here in verse 1 of chapter 10, Mitchell?
Maybe they were in the nation, the government wasn't in good shape, so he raised taxes such to get the government in good
Yeah, they could be in bad financial settings, because we know extra biblically, though some were successful, later some of these campaigns into Greece that Ahasuerus leads, or Xerxes as he's known outside of the Bible, don't go well. Yes, Cass?
I think if we knew which tax this was, we could place Esther in history. And we can place Esther in history already, but I think it might be, I don't know, but it might be God telling us he imposed the tax in this year and the events happened in this year, and so we can place Esther in historical context.
Certainly I think that...
Chapter 1, but...
Yeah, chapter 1 does that as well, and then put that in your back pocket. We're going to talk about that here the last 15 minutes. Verse 2 invites you. It says, hey, all this stuff is written down in the Medo-Persian Chronicles. You go check it out there. Some were saying, throughout the land, maybe tied in that Ahasuerus, that this is maybe Mordecai's doing, helping Gentile prosperity come to the crown. Some people, Mitchell, actually were pointing out, and it was kind of theory, but they were like, oh, maybe this is what the Jews didn't plunder. Because remember, Haman was promising the king an unfathomable amount of money if you let me do this, and all that money was going to come from the plundered Jews. So it may be tied in with Mordecai's authority. Just general power of the Persian Empire. Some people are kind of like it's a down note, which is just a reminder they're still in exile. I don't know. I don't know what to make with that interruption. Jennifer?
Well, historically, if you're looking, King Ahasuerus was Xerxes.
Mm-hmm.
He did a lot for, he was one of the greatest kings in Egypt or wherever it was.
Persia, yeah.
And he did a lot in promoting government and establishing.
He expanded a lot of Persia's empire and influence. Yeah.
He even had a lot of inventions and stuff. So I saw a little bit about how great he was and how he added to the history of the world.
Oh, yeah. No, the Persians, we could go down a whole list of things that the Persian Empire added to, society. But even with the grandeur of these guys, like we said, Xerxes, a.k.a. Ahasuerus, as fantastic of a king as he is politically for Persia overall, right? He's portrayed as, this godless doofus in Esther. Everyone has to tell him what to do. We've been talking about that ad nauseum now. And that really is a theme throughout no matter the empire. Which is, as great as it is, they're people, and they rebel. This is not lasting. The nations are as nothing before the Lord, as Isaiah would say. I mean, even Jesus' day, now we're making me go real meta, or real big here. Even Jesus' day, you have the greatest theologians in the world, supposed to. With the Jewish people, they've got the true God, they've got the stuff, and the greatest empire in the world, and they kill the one innocent guy ever to live. That's how great people are, right? They're horrible, right? And the Bible makes that point in 500 different ways, in 500 different stories. Esther's no different. So hopefully, I remember, and there's more reversals than this. These are like the big picture reversals. I showed this in the very first week right after New Year Day, where, right, you see the switch. Haman's going higher and higher, what we were just talking about. Last week we mentioned how Mordecai's given the signet ring. Mordecai's mourning. Now Mordecai is exalted. We've talked about this. The fasting and weeping changes to feasting and celebrating for the Jews. The gallows should be for Mordecai. Psych, they end up being for Haman. You have Zeresh advising Haman, and then Zeresh advising Haman, saying that Mordecai is going to actually overthrow you if he's Jewish. And then Haman, of course, seeking honor for himself in contrast with that. And then the swing point was most of chapter 6. Where Haman was forced to honor Mordecai. So there's all these reversals in Esther. Those are just the big ones where flip, 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 flip. Again, chapter 9, verse 1 states it in the most obvious form when it comes to the Jews on that day defending themselves. The reverse occurred. If you kind of summed up the humor and dramatic irony of Esther, that would be it. The reverse occurred, right? The expectations were subversed. Because of God's sovereignty and care hidden in the background, as it may be. That's definitely the big thing here. The roles being reversed and God's hiddenness. Now, I have been surprised the last couple weeks since we're kind of beginning to wrap up with, or we are wrapping up with Esther. A handful of you, more than I expected, were asking about the historicity of Esther and things of that nature. So thanks to the age of the internet and information, everyone's asking these questions, which is great. We don't know who wrote Esther. I thought about doing this in class 1, but I was like, I just want to get into it. So here we are. This is what I get for not doing it. But we don't know who wrote Esther. Most of its writings in the late 5th century. There may be some like later editions in the 3rd century BC. So, right, this is 500, 400, 300 years-ish before Jesus Christ walks the earth. Now, the events themselves are under King Xerxes. He's called Ahasuerus. 486 to 465. We know that's when he is king, so somewhere in there is when these events take place. And then, of course, is it historical? Because people who, whether they question the canonicity of Esther as some believer, or they're just a skeptic of the Bible altogether, they're like, hey, there's things in Esther that don't line up with history, and they're like, so therefore, it either shouldn't be in the canon, or if they're an unbeliever altogether, they're like, no, this is just another thing to say that this ain't God's word. And quite frankly, they're weaker than you'd think. The provinces, I'm going to mention a lot about Herodotus. Herodotus was a Greek writer and historian during this time when the Persians were at their biggest and baddest. So he's a very important historian, and he's right a lot of the times. He's been proven to be rather accurate. But some people are like, look, the provinces, the number of provinces that Herodotus puts is different than in Esther's 127, but they're different words. The closest thing I could think of an analogy that, I can't remember if it was Nathan Ward or N.T. Wright. Someone was saying it would be like saying mixing up state versus county. So some of these things are just really goofy. We've mentioned this. Esther's queenship, some people say it's not legal. The Persian king is supposed to marry a Persian from 7 specific families. Nor is Esther recorded outside of the Bible. All right, we don't have Esther extra biblically, right? But we know Xerxes' father and other Persian kings, they did not follow the marriage law either. And Esther, right? Xerxes' queen was a woman not named Esther. We have recorded from Herodotus, I believe, Amestris. Now, Amestris could be Vashti. The chronology is difficult. N.T. Wright made the argument that, well, Esther is actually a shorter version of this name, or it could be another wife that we just don't know about. No clue. Some people will say, hey, having Mordecai as second in command as a Jew, why is that not recorded extra biblically? Now, there are either Marduka or Marduko, that's playing off of the Babylonian god Marduk. Mordecai's name's out, right? You're in exile. We're going to name you after our gods. There are 4 Persian officials that sound like the name Mordecai, but it is a very common name, and it's far from being nailed down as there's Mordecai extra biblically. There's 4 of them, and I'm giving you 10,000-foot view here. There's chronological questions as well. And then some accusations are, wait, unchangeable Persian laws, that's also only in the Bible. We don't hear about that outside of the Bible, which I don't think that's necessarily true, actually. Diodorus Siculus records that there was laws that could not be, and he uses the terminology of undone. Apparently there's some translation debates about that. That's how complicated all this is. But he ends up calling that a few lines down, the law of the Persians, which is the language that the Bible uses for this. So that sounds like to me that very well could be extra biblical there, that it's recorded that the Persians generally had this rule that you can't undo what the king decrees. But if you can't tell with these things, not only are they kind of minute, except for the Esther one, all these arguments are really from silence, which is, well, history outside doesn't say exactly what the Bible says within itself, therefore it must be wrong, and no matter what the topic is, right, arguments from silence are just that, from silence. Like, that doesn't really prove or disprove really anything. You're just kind of left with, well, maybe, but that's a really, really, really far cry from disproving anything. Now, some people then go to what's called textual criticism. You might hear in more scholarly circles, textual criticism like the very detailed study of the text and critiquing it. Some people say, well, there could be internal inconsistencies or internal questions within the book of Esther itself, such as, really, 180 days of banqueting in a row? Does anyone do that? And first of all, the text doesn't say that. It does say there were 180 days of feasting and banqueting, but I mean, I think it stands with reason that, well, there's still responsibilities and jobs going on. It's not like literally nothing got done for 180 days. Otherwise, they would have gotten taken over by someone else or something. And then what I mean by could be prep for Greece, because I'm just limited on space on these screens, is a lot of scholars were saying this is probably the 180 days of banqueting and planning leading up to an invasion of Greece led by Xerxes Ahasuerus. That's why they're having those 180 days going on. But either way, it doesn't say no one did nothing for 180 days. It just says it's 180 days surrounded up by banqueting. Of course, you know, people are still getting jobs done. Some people say Mordecai is way too old to be doing anything if, according to chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. I actually already addressed this when we were just going through chapter 2. If you go back to Esther chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, it gives his lineage. I don't know if you guys remember this. I know we've covered a lot. Mordecai is the son of Yair, son of Shammai, son of Kish, Benjaminite. Kish, verse 6, Kish had been taken in exile from Jerusalem with the other captives when Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took King Jeconiah of Judah into exile. So depending on your translation and people's discussion, they're like, hey, if Mordecai was literally taken, he'd be like 120-something years old. I think it's pretty clear, no, Kish was taken. And in other stories in the Bible, someone who's really old, the Bible tells you. If Mordecai were some really ancient guy in the story, I feel like it'd play a significant part of the story. If this guy was ancient, he'd, right? No, his family was taken. That's how he wound up here. Then some people, of course, the story of Esther, which is go look and find all these wonderful virgins for me, says the king, to find my new queen, and it's empire-wide. And people say, were virgins really gathered in droves from all over the empire? Because that is excessive. That is really expensive and difficult. But people have done crazier things. Why not? We know, extra-biblically, Artaxerxes had virgins from all the land to replenish, that's the language is used, replenished his harem constantly, as gross as that is. And Herodotus records that 500 boys were gathered each year to be the king's eunuchs, another gross and disturbing stat. So we know, extra-biblically, with other guys, that they've rounded up boys and girls, you know, whether to be virgins and to be concubines or to be eunuchs to serve in the king's palace. We know, extra-biblically, that as expensive and as inefficient and as messed up as it is, they did this. So it's not even an internal inconsistency within Esther at all. I could not believe that. I'm not putting up things. Straw man is where you put up the worst argument you could for someone else and then knock it over and say, look how smart I am. You think this. And they're not trying to say that. I'm not trying to put up poor arguments or arguments that aren't, you know, from skeptics to just look good. Because this next one, I was surprised at how many skeptics said this. A lot of people are saying, would genocide really happen? I know. I'm like, what? I'm like, what? It was not like one or two skeptics out there. Like a handful of sexual critics were like, would this really happen though? They're like, could a guy trick a king, and on top of the trick that the big grand finale is, we're going to wipe out an entire group of people? I could not believe, I was shocked at the amount of, it wasn't like a ton, but it was enough that I was like, really? Where people were surprised that genocide would be an option. I was just stunning to me. I mean, the Holocaust was not that long ago. I mean, that was shocking. Shocking. I don't put that up there just to look how smart we are about that. So seriously put up by people. Some people, it's something I just overlooked, where people were like a 50 cubit or roughly a 75-foot gallows, a stake being built overnight. The question of, was it really built overnight and why? That is astoundingly tall. And probably, my easiest answer is probably this is an exaggeration for narrative effect about the pride of Haman. And if it is literal, well, then other people are like, well, it's probably like on a hill or something like that. There's a lot of explanations. I don't even know why this is brought up so many times. So if you can't tell whether they're external or internal inconsistencies, Again, these arguments questioning Esther are really based on the silence of history. Those are not good arguments. And by the way, Herodotus is not a modern historian at all. He doesn't think exactly like us. Not everything he records is history. Some of it is legend, some of it's hearsay. He's very accurate when we find out what's history. Herodotus is a very important historian figure, but he doesn't think and write like we do. And arguing from silence to attack the biblical narrative and its authenticity or reliability several times, as some of you may well know, gets proven over and over again that, you know what, the Bible, even if you don't think it's God's word, it lines up pretty well up with history and lines up archaeologically with a lot of things. Before Esther, right, a really famous one would be the Nabonidus cylinder. Textual criticism is really a post-Enlightenment thing, so the 1700s, the 1800s. Belshazzar was only recorded in the Bible in Daniel 5, and so textual critics of the Bible in the 17 and 1800s were saying it's a mistake, or Belshazzar is just purely a fictional character. And then in 1854, they discovered what was called the Nabonidus cylinder. And lo and behold, it identified Belshazzar as Nabonidus' son and co-regent, which is what Daniel 5:1 calls him. And it even explained why Daniel was offered to be third in command and not second in command in Daniel 5:29. That's just one random example that's roughly in this time period, a little bit before Esther, where people are like, oh, Belshazzar, it's only in the Bible. He's nowhere else. Must be wrong. And then something comes in and confirms that. So arguments from silence are not good. The Bible's record has been pretty good about that. Now, none of that proves Esther's historicity, right? None of that is like, oh, Esther's for sure in. And I'm pointing out with those arguments is those are far from really strong arguments to say Esther's somehow historically inaccurate or impossible. They're really just arguments from silence. So that does leave you, and again, I was surprised that there was like 4 or 5 of you, so this is your guys' fault why I'm doing this. There was like 4 or 5 of you who were asking, like, it's written like a play. 3 of you said that. It's like a play. It is. It is kind of like in that sense. So what exactly is the genre of Esther? You really have 4 options. 1 is just straight up history. 2, more of a novelistic history. 3, a historical novel, or 4, it's pure fiction. By the way, the difference between novelistic history refers to like a historical account that's written in a narrative style, a lot of the Bible, and it focuses on character development, stuff like that. A historical novel is a fictional story that's set in a specific historical period. I mean, even like, Marvel's done that where, Endgame was like in 2017 or something like that, where they put it, oh, look, it's New York City, and here's Iron Man. Is Iron Man real? Well, no, but it's in a real location. So those are the 4 takes people have. Wherever you kind of lean in that scope, don't miss the forest through the trees, right? Even if it was fiction, I don't think that, and I'll list here why I don't think it is. Even if it was a story, so to say, it'd be more akin to like the parables of Jesus. Probably literally there wasn't a guy who was scattering seed in all the wrong places, but it had a spiritual eternal truth. There was still a theological point and message, so don't miss that. I'm probably number 2, that's a novelistic history. But why from the text, this is the last question I asked, I realize the time. I don't have time to ask the question. I wasn't going to ask this, I'm sorry. But why it's probably historical is, look, we ended the book, some of you guys pointed it out. There's chronological references. There's an invitation to search records. I mean, that's very specific. Again, specific location of setting and time. And then, of course, Purim is an actual feast. Now, you could have an actual feast that derives from legend, of course. But you kind of add all those things up together, and it sure seems to be historical. Whereas people are like, well, the non-historical elements is the narrative designs and the rising conflicts, the clear turning point, climax, and resolution, right? It's like a play. It's entertaining. There's the very literary elements include dramatic irony and hyperbole and comedy, satire. But remember, either one of those, just because you're using historical places or figures, doesn't negate that it's legend, like Iron Man in New York City, nor does using narrative skills or literary elements negate its historicity. Now, Esther's unique in the sense of it really does sound like a play in that sense. But you go read 1 and 2 Samuel and follow the story of David, And there's lots of cute little, right, elements with the story of David with repeated words and whatnot at all. Mitchell, you got a thought to help us out here?
Yeah, so chapter 9, verse 20, it says Mordecai recorded these things. So it seems very plausible that Mordecai at some later date after this writes all this down
For sure.
in the form of a story.
And that is why I think it's history.
And you brought up that Belshazzar is mentioned on the cylinder.
Oh yeah, Belshazzar.
Daniel isn't.
Yes.
Because Daniel's his Hebrew name. And in this book of the Bible, only the Hebrew names are given.
Right.
So if Esther had a Persian name, we don't know what it was.
Which is what N.T. Wright was saying about his other queen's name. Totally possible. And the guy I was referring to, it gets confusing. Belteshazzar is Daniel. The guy in Daniel 5 is Belshazzar. All the names sound the same. But I'm sure all of our American names sound the same to other cultures as well, right? Is no one clock guy? Do we just have bonus time tonight? Wow, we just get to go all night long. Any last comments or questions about this? And if you want my take, hopefully it's been clear. I'm probably in number 2, novelistic history, in the sense of it seems very clear these things really did happen, and the author makes this into a beautiful artwork to tell the story. Cass, last comment.
If you've ever read a memoir,
Yes.
if you've ever read a comedic memoir or a devastating memoir, I mean, this seems like a biography or a memoir that has been a little bit embellished to use these techniques. And
Yes.
whoever wrote it was human, whether it was Mordecai, whoever, God wrote it.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
whether
Yeah.
or not it's history doesn't matter, because God wrote it.
Yep. That's always the fallback. Very good. That's very helpful, like a memoir. All right. Appreciate you guys' kind attention and answers per usual. We'll have a pause. I think we'll do a little bit more wrap up on Esther next week. And then if I'm looking at it and it's time, there'll be a surprise reveal as to what we're doing next. So there's no homework, I guess. You're free. We're going to do a little more wrap up on Esther.